Alright, YouTube, there's a video up by a user called Sukhwant Singh called Oak Island Money Pit Resolved or Mystery Resolved, in which he argues that the money pit, which is of course up on Oak Island up in coastal, eastern Canada, that the pit is actually a more or less natural formation formed by essentially a sinkhole which absorbed at some point a Viking ship that these oaken layers that people are finding every roughly 10 feet are actually essentially partitions between pieces of the deck. That this is essentially not buried treasure or anything like that. It's just literally a ship that ran aground and slowly over time sunk into the natural sinkhole that enveloped it. And of course, part of this seems to be based on the fact that, yes, this location, Oak Island, this general region, does suffer from occasional sinkholes. There is subsistence of the ground in this location. So, on the surface, if you don't dig any deeper, this explanation seems to make sense because, in the absence of any evidence that it's actually some sort of pirate treasure hoard or something like that, it makes sense to assume that it's some sort of naturally occurring feature, that these layers maybe weren't actually placed there so much as that it's a part of this ship that got sucked into the ground. There are several reasons why I can refute this. Partially because of things found on the site, and number two, because of the structure of the site itself. And number three, the time period involved, which you can at least infer from some of the things that you found there. The first thing is that at 120 feet, which is about as low as they've gone, there's an iron plate present in this pit, apparently about an inch thick plate of solid iron. There would be, if this were a naturally occurring feature, if this were just essentially a large Viking ship that got sucked into a sinkhole, why would the Vikings have been carrying, number one, this iron plate around? It wouldn't make any sense. And number two, how would it get into that position in the ship? One of the things that he argues is that archaeologists have found quite large Viking ships. Of course, the average Viking ship was maybe 50 or 60 feet long. These longboats, for their time, were fairly large, but they weren't particularly impressive on an absolute scale. They certainly weren't nearly as large as the ships that you see later during the Renaissance and in eras such as that. For its time, though, it was a well-developed ship. Of course, some of these longboats could float in and sail around in 3 or 4 feet of water. However, this shaft, number one, doesn't show any features of a ship. Because when it was first excavated to the first 25 feet, it didn't come to a point. The kids or young men that were digging up this site didn't find a prominence sticking up out of the ground. What they found was a flat layer, roughly 10 feet below the surface, which he would argue apparently is part of this partition. I guess the idea is that all of this stuff sort of settled into layers within this sinkhole. I'm not sure that's actually how a sinkhole would work. Again, there's no reason why the Vikings would be carrying around a large iron plate with them. In order for this to have been a Viking ship that literally upended and got sucked down into a sinkhole, it would have to be probably the largest Viking ship that was ever constructed. Because this has been excavated to 120 feet. At least it hasn't been fully excavated to that point, but the bore has gone down that low and found that it hits this iron layer. If it were simply a Viking ship, that probably would not be present. Number two, there's concrete in it. The Vikings were not known for using concrete. There would have been, especially since this is apparently a flat layer of concrete, and it's not, by the way, it's not a naturally occurring concretion. This is apparently a refined, poured, man-made concrete, which is supposedly around some sort of oaken chest, again, as evidenced by the fact that they bored down all the way to the iron barrier. then looked through the layers. So they can tell, they can't tell all of what's in there, but they can tell what its rough composition is. They know that there are layers of wood and so forth, layers of clay. Those, I'll give you, could, in theory, be the result of some natural occurrence, a sinkhole and things pouring into the sinkhole over time and then settling out into layers. However, chests don't generally do that. If this was a chest in a Viking ship, you wouldn't expect it to be encased in concrete. That makes absolutely no sense. He's saying, by the way, essentially with his talk, he's essentially saying that this site dates to 1200 AD or thereabouts or somewhat before that. Let alone that this is apparently the largest Viking ship in apparently for what he's saying that ever existed, because the longest other than that I believe is about 98 to 100 feet long. Beyond that, why would there be then concrete surrounding this chest and then on the bottom there's an iron plate? It makes no sense. There was also the presence of gold. When the boar was sent down by the Triton Company, they found several gold links, along with, and I'll discuss this as well, the piece of parchment that they found. The Vikings as a culture did not give particular importance to gold artifacts. In fact, they traded away their gold and used it to buy much cheaper, but which they thought was better, silver. And the early Viking warriors, when they first began to encounter cultures that were obsessed with hoarding gold, must have been quite confused as to why individuals would be enamored to this metal. It's too soft to make tools out of for the most part. You can make jewelry out of it, but it's no use for armor. They preferred silver. So if this were a Viking vessel and this were some sort of treasure, it wouldn't make sense that there would be gold in it. The only reason the Vikings would want gold is they would plunder it and then trade it for their silver or other goods that they wanted. But this is a ship in Canada. This is supposedly a Viking ship that ran aground or was deliberately foundered in Canada. If they had been looting Europe at the time and amassing gold, they would have brought it back up to Norway or Sweden or Denmark or one of these areas that they controlled. They wouldn't have gone all the way across the Atlantic Ocean for Canada, especially around this time period. They had explored Iceland and they had explored Greenland. And we do know that the Vikings did make it to what is now coastal Canada, even down as far, perhaps, as Maine. Some people say they might have gone as far as Virginia. But there are no lasting remains in these locations south of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in that area. There are no lasting remains. There would have been no reason why a Viking ship sailing in 1200 AD would have taken chests full of loot to Canada. There wouldn't have been anything they could trade it for, because there weren't any real permanent Viking settlements at the time in that area of the world. The furthest they would have gone is Iceland. Even Greenland, while it had a permanent settlement so-called, it wouldn't have had any resources of great value for them to exploit in return for, unloading their loot. There's also the parchment fragment. And when I spoke to this individual, he said, well, it doesn't make a sentence, it's just letters. Yes, that's not my point. The point is, if this had been a piece of parchment that Vikings were using for some sort of notation making or communication, it would not have been written in English script. It wouldn't make any sense, and it certainly wouldn't have been, as this piece of parchment appears to have been, written by fountain pen. This indicates a date that is, this parchment probably wouldn't have even survived if it dated to that time period, in this very wet, rather swampy location, even if it was within a chest buried deep underground. You can then go, this individual again is claiming that this is a ship that upended, got sunk into the ground. It is basically a natural formation, the only thing being it's literally an upended Viking ship. In other words, anything in there would be coincidental. It wouldn't be a deliberately buried treasure, although there might be some sort of spoils of war or something on board the ship. Apparently gold from Europe that they took to Canada for no reason. Um, it doesn't make sense that a Viking ship upended in that time period would have survived for that long in that climate. And then, look at the design of the site. There were deliberately dug, excavated shafts leading into what is called the money pit from at least 2 parts of the coast, possibly 3, that were filled in with gravel, that were filled in with coconut fiber, essentially a crude filtration system, that were cobbled over, that literally stone networks designed specifically to funnel water into this location. Why would a group of Vikings, having run aground either on purpose or on accident, they banked their ship accidentally on this island, said, oh, screw it, and then wandered off into the wilderness and interbred with Native Americans. Why would they take their time to excavate essentially what would amount to about 1/3 of this island, which they would have had to do to place these stone networks in here, these pipes essentially? Why would they have done that? It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. These are man-made features. They're clearly man-made features. Nobody disputes that they are man-made features. They dispute maybe who put what there and when they did and for what purpose, but they don't dispute that this is a man-made feature. These were clearly laid there by somebody who had at least moderately good engineering knowledge. The Vikings did have good engineering knowledge. Another thing being, the Vikings were not known for packing goods in coconut fiber. At the time that he is predicting this so-called Viking ship got run aground and upended in this location, you did not have, at least as far as we know, very much in the way of trade to that location. The Vikings came down into Europe and looted, and then they went back north. Yes, there were Viking migration movements, and they actually founded quite a bit in what is now Russia, the Ukraine, places like that, yes. But there wasn't a whole lot of trade in that time period because, remember, this is the Dark Ages when Europe doesn't have much to trade to begin with. There wasn't much trade to any location of the world which would have had coconut fiber. What you see is much later, as Europe enters the Renaissance, then they begin to absorb these tropical goods, things like coconut fiber, using them on their ships. That's when you get the pirates, that's when you get the colonies, that's when you get all of these spoils of war, entering Europe in many cases for the first time. I debate that coconut fiber could even really last that long in that particular environment. This is coastal Canada. It's very wet. It's very swampy. The soil is very acidic, which isn't particularly good for preserving certain artifacts. We also have evidence, at least in one of the other boreholes, which isn't even contemporary, not even right next to the actual money pit. We have some evidence through imaging of the ground that there may be another burial site nearby. What they're proclaiming now is that this shaft essentially could be a shaft to a larger tunnel network that involves essentially a large excavated area below the entire third of the island that has numerous burials and what appear to be chests and so forth. This isn't certain. We're not certain that this is what's there, but it's been theorized based on the imaging that's been done that it's quite possible that this is a mass burial site containing a great deal of material. Why would the Vikings have gone through all that trouble, especially if this were a natural sinkhole that absorbed the ship over the course of years or decades or whatever? Why would these other shafts, meant apparently specifically to drain water into it should it be excavated, why would they have been built? It doesn't make any sense. I guess you could theorize maybe they built those channels to try to get water under the ship to pull it back out. The problem being, in order for it to have sunk that low and sort of subsided and layered and so forth, it would have taken many years. There's no evidence that there was ever a prolonged Viking expedition in this location. There are no Viking artifacts on this particular island. There are apparently Cornish artifacts. There are British artifacts. There are perhaps other artifacts from latter-day Europe from the 17 and 1800s, but we don't have anything from the Viking era. And if he wanted to prove this, he could, of course, get an archaeological dig going and dig transects across this island. And if he were to find a couple of Viking coins and, some silver jewelry that may date to the medieval period, then we'd be in business. Then we could say maybe it was either purposely or accidentally sunk into the ground in this location. But there's no evidence of that. It would have been very strange for coconut fiber in the time period he's talking about to have been used in a ship. When you're talking about coconut fiber being used to pack things in crates, you're talking about essentially the 1500s at earliest and later. You're talking about the Renaissance, you're talking about the early colonial period, you're not talking about the medieval era. It just wouldn't have happened. They would have been packing things in straw in that time period because it would have been domestically produced. It would have been easier to obtain. The Byzantines might have been the only group at the time that would have had ready access to the kind of trade to Asia or Africa that would have essentially given them the ability to use coconut, and then they probably wouldn't have used it for that. It wouldn't have made any sense because it'd be so much more expensive. To the longboat's size, he's essentially predicting a 120 or plus foot longboat with an iron plate in one end. That doesn't make sense. Longboats simply were not generally built that long. They call them longboats because they were long and shallow and had a low draft and they could sail in 3 or 4 feet of water. Most of them were not anywhere near 100 feet long, let alone 120. And I will point this out. The units of measurement in between these layers are almost exactly 10 feet. This points to English building. Essentially, they were measuring it in English units, feet and inches and so forth. This doesn't point to I don't know if the Vikings used feet and inches or if they used some other arcane measurement system during the medieval period. But this would point, at least in my mind, more towards the British era. Of course, remember, this site was discovered in 1795. The British owned that piece of land. The British owned Canada. It was a British colony, a system of these provinces, essentially, in the greater colony of Canada. The British owned it. There are at least anecdotal tales that before this location was found and started to be excavated by this group of kids or young men, there are at least anecdotal tales that there were lights on the island, and so forth. It seems, and the intact block and tackle, I think, is the last nail in the coffin of this person's theory, when you consider that if that block and tackle could have been put there coincidentally, but if we overlook the possibility of coincidence, it has something to do with the money pit, and was presumably used to lower materials into this pit during the time it was being constructed. If it had been put there in 1200, or 1100 AD, it wouldn't still be there. It would have completely and utterly rotted away in that climate. Whereas if it was put there a year or 2 years or a few months before it was found in the first place by this group of youths or young men, then yes, it would have been completely intact. It would have still been hanging in the tree, and it was. So either this story is kind of muddled and the youths themselves brought the block and tackle and people just sort of overlooked that and said it was in the tree beforehand, or it was put there by whoever lowered the stuff into this pit, or apparently Vikings had block and tackles that could last, several centuries in a very stiff climate, in a very cold, rainy, wet, acidic seaside island climate. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense at all when you really think of it. When you're thinking of the time period, he's claiming that these remains date to 1200 or so. That allows hundreds and hundreds of years to pass during which these materials would have been decaying. The parchment, for instance, in this particular location, this area's wet soil and so forth, wouldn't have survived. It wouldn't have made sense for it to survive. Even the wood would have mostly, I would think, by that point, rotted away. Why, again, also, why would there be layers of spruce interspersed with the oak if this were a Viking longship? And when they date these materials, depending on what dating system you're using and who you ask, it either dates to far antiquity, the BC period, or the medieval period, or it dates to about the 1700s, which would make more sense because of the intact block and tackle. If the block and tackle alone, if we could determine whether that was there because by whoever dug the pit or if the youths themselves brought it, then we could probably solve the mystery. Because if the youths put it there, then it could be any age. It would be difficult to tell. If they didn't, if this was an intact block and tackle by whoever lowered materials into this pit, then we know that it had to be fairly recent, during the 1790s when it was first discovered. But Singh's theory here does not make sense. It's an interesting theory. He backs it up with at least some circumstantial evidence, but there are too many things at this site that don't coincide with a medieval period Viking vessel. From the size of the vessel to the contents of this supposed vessel, to the stories around how it was found in the first place, it doesn't make sense that this is actually an upended and sinkhole-addled Viking ship. The block and tackle, the presence of gold, the presence of English lettering on this parchment fragment. Definitely, again, I think the most damning evidence against his theory would be simply that these drainage systems dug from the coastline into this shaft were present. They were clearly man-made. They are clearly not natural formations. They are straight. They are filled in with things like coconut fiber and clay. Man made those. In order to have made them, this whole site had to be extensively excavated. My own thought, my own theory, I believe that the British Royal Navy, at some point, either because they had a secret mission or because one of their ships looted, a pirate trading post or something and got all the treasure, I think they buried their loot there. Probably dismantled their ship to do it, and then wandered off into Canada at large and were never heard from again. And of course, things like that, stranger things have happened. The most hip explanation is it's Captain Kidd's treasure, it's Blackbeard's treasure, it's some pirate's treasure. I question that a pirate ship would contain the type of individuals that would be necessary to excavate that large an area in a short period of time, deposit the goods, bury it back up, and then sail back out to destinations unknown. And if it was pirate treasure, they presumably would have come back, re-excavated it, and taken it away. Actually, the idea that pirates routinely buried their treasure, especially in something elaborate like this, rather than going to the Caribbean, to Cuba or something, and spending their loot, makes no sense whatsoever. There would have been no reason for them to bury this unless they intended to become permanent residents of Canada within the British Empire. I suppose it's possible that some pirates that may have been hired by the British might have buried something there. Some people have looked at this site and seen the hands of French engineers in it. Of course, that's also possible as well, although for it to have been the French, this was a British colony at the time, that would have been a dangerous deed to do. It's also been speculated it could have something to do with the Masons or the Templars or something. I think it's entirely possible that the site contains older than 1700s era relics and treasures. I think if they find them there, they'll find, though, that it was probably deposited there in the 1700s, the 1790s, roughly 1780s, somewhere around there, that it was contemporary to the time period in which it was first discovered. This stone with the runes on it, by the way, they've never actually seen the original stone because somebody took it and apparently used it in their fireplace and destroyed it. There's no actual evidence there ever was a rune stone. This could entirely be a fabrication that's taking people's minds off the real picture, which is clearly this is, number one, a man-made site. The drainage systems dug to vent water into the central shaft is evidence of that. It is a man-made site. Number two, as I've just said throughout this entire video, it's probably not a submerged ship. It's probably not, it doesn't have anything to do with natural features. I don't believe this was a sinkhole. It boggles the mind as to why Vikings would be carrying around a large iron plate in the front of their ship and why they were using wood from the island itself when they supposedly sailed from destinations abroad, carrying a full loot of gold. Naturally, they've never found any remains in here either. Here's the one last thing. If this ship ran aground and got sunk into a sinkhole, if the Vikings didn't survive, then they'd be in the ship. So when they were excavating, they would find things like skeletons. If not, why would there be gold and parchment and all of these other materials present in the site, since they presumably, if they survived, would have taken these things with them wherever they went? They either would have constructed another ship, or tried to, on this island and sailed back to Sweden or whatever, or they would have wandered into the Canadian wilderness and maybe interbred with the natives or whatever, but they still would have had that treasure and so forth with them. They wouldn't have simply left it on a foundering ship on this island off Nova Scotia. It doesn't make any sense to think that they would have done that. So the finding of gold, without finding bodies and so forth, indicates that this is not a foundered ship, either put there purposely or they ran aground and then it just slowly sink into the ground over time. It doesn't make sense. His entire theory, while interesting and while well sourced by the evidence he does have, simply does not hold up when you consider the features of this site. So to Sukhwant Singh, your theory is interesting, but I do not believe it. There are far better explanations. The main one, I think personally, being the British buried something there. We're not exactly sure what it is. It probably loot from raiding some French fort or, attacking a pirate vessel. They took the loot back or whatever and buried it there. Because of the block and tackle and the repair of the site in general and the it's fairly obvious that this is more on the contemporary side than the ancient side. I do not believe that this site could have been constructed by a ship full of Vikings in the medieval era, because clearly human construction did go on at this site again because of those same drainage systems. A sunken Viking vessel does not magically grow fairly clearly man-made, even man-filtered drainage systems into the central pit. That's about all. Peace out.